Russia is still pushing for Pokrovsk. That comes as no surprise, as Vladimir Putin has wanted that city for years, and he launched an entire summer offensive designed to take it. The offensive failed, but Russia is still advancing, slowly but taking territory in the process. But that territory is coming at a high cost. The road to Russian success in Pokrovsk is being paved in the bodies of Putin's dead soldiers, and Ukraine is making sure that Russia suffers for every move it makes. Ukraine's brutal push at Pokrovsk is making Russia bleed for every inch. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which reported that Ukraine's forces have unleashed a series of counterattacks in the Pokrovsk region that are eliminating Russian troops by the dozens. Pockets of Russian soldiers are being isolated and taken out, Euromaidan Press claims, with the bulk of Ukraine's counteroffensive taking place near the key city of Dobropilya. In doing so, Ukraine has once again broken the encirclement of Pokrovsk that Russia was attempting to achieve, and it's done so by retaking villages surrounding the city and sending elite units into battle against Russia's overwhelming manpower. We start in Kucheriv Yar. On October 31st, United 24 media reported that both aviation and special forces of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, or HUR, had launched a multi-layered airborne operation in and around the city of Pokrovsk. That operation has a simple purpose. HUR operatives would enter regions near Pokrovsk that Russia had already declared as captured so they could be retaken. By liberating these regions, the encirclement strategy that Russia is trying to use against Pokrovsk will be broken once more, ensuring Ukraine doesn't have to defend the city against assaults from all directions. Each of the districts that HUR would focus on is considered strategically important to Ukraine from a logistical perspective, with United 24 adding that several helicopters had already been involved in the operation. Even the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, Kirilo Budanov, would be involved, as he was traveling to the site of the operation to oversee everything that HUR had planned. That's all we knew at the end of October. During the first days of November, plenty more details emerged, and Kucheriv Yar lay at the center of the whole operation. The village had been under partial Russian occupation since mid-August, Forbes reported toward the end of October. By October 22nd, Ukraine was ready to launch its HUR-led operation, the details of which are only now emerging. Paratroopers from Ukraine's air assault forces landed in the village, breaking through the Russian lines in the process. Once there, they turned their attention to one of Putin's biggest targets, Ukraine's civilians. As of July 31st, 13,883 of those civilians had been killed by Russia's assaults, with a further 35,548 being injured, Statista reports. On October 22nd, 10 civilians were able to escape that fate. The air assault forces evacuated them while under fire from Russia's troops, eventually managing to coordinate their escapes using drones. With the civilians safely out of the picture, the air assault forces turned their attention back to the Russian soldiers. While full details of what the air assault forces pulled off are scant, we know for sure that Kucheriv Yar is officially liberated. Ukraine released drone footage showing around 50 Russian soldiers who were stationed in the village surrendering to Ukraine's troops. Forbes explains why this is so important to Ukraine. The recapture of Kucheriv Yar is vital for Ukraine's control of the region around the city of Dobropilya and is a major morale boost, the outlet reports. Further, this victory highlights a fundamental weakness in Russia's current offensive strategy, undermining its ability to hold captured territory. That last point is especially important. Putin will be scratching his head, asking himself how this has happened all over again. Throughout the summer, Russia took villages like Kucheriv Yar, only to lose them again in short order. Forbes highlights this, noting that Russia has adopted a similar attritional approach to the one it took earlier in the Ukraine war to inch its way closer to Pokrovsk. The first part of this approach tends to work. Russia throws soldier after soldier into the meat grinder, wearing down Ukraine's defenses until a gap is created in the lines. A handful of soldiers stream in, and that's where it all starts to go wrong for Russia. Those soldiers take up defensive positions with the goal of holding out until reinforcements arrive. The problem, from the Russian perspective, is that the small breakthroughs rarely include any armor. They're carried out by troops that are on foot or at best riding motorcycles into battle. All these soldiers succeed in doing is breaking through gaps in Ukraine's kill zones without neutralizing the kill zones themselves. Ukraine's drones continue to fly, the gaps get closed, and the Russian soldiers who achieve the breakthroughs end up trapped in isolated pockets from which there is no escape. As reinforcements fail to come and Ukraine cuts off the logistics that are supposed to keep the entrapped soldiers supplied with food and equipment, morale starts to break. A soldier can only fight for so long, and as hard as Putin wants them to fight, on an empty stomach and with no ammunition. Eventually, the troops in these isolated pockets break and Ukraine takes advantage. That's what it did to great effect in Kucheriv Yar. Its paratroopers dropped in and liberated the village within days. The HUR operatives didn't even have to kill most of the Russian soldiers, as the majority were ready to surrender as soon as they saw what was coming for them. Ukraine is using Russia's own tactic to break the collective spirit of the enemy. There is a flaw in Russia's strategy, and Putin seems unable to do anything to change it. Retaking Kucheriv Yar would have been a massive achievement on its own for the HUR operation. However, Ukraine had the wind in its sails and plenty of momentum, especially as so many of Russia's soldiers chose to surrender rather than fight. So Ukraine pushed on. With Kucheriv Yar liberated, Ukraine's forces pushed east to arrive at the village of Zatishok. Like Kucheriv Yar, that village had been held by Russia since August, the New Voice of Ukraine reports. Not anymore. Ukraine liberated it and kept on pushing. A third village named Shuketska has also been clawed back out of Russia's grasp, UNN reported on October 26th. Euromaidan press reports that Ukraine conducted a house-clearing operation that saw it sending ground-based assault troops to these villages. These troops were supported by both reconnaissance and strike drones, which helped HUR capture a further 7 Russian soldiers to add to the 50 or so taken into custody from Kucheriv Yar. But this time, Russia tried to fight back. Ukraine's general staff confirmed that 44 Russian soldiers were killed and a further 8 were wounded in Ukraine's push into the other 2 villages. Now the clearing operation continues. Though the liberation of these 3 villages represents a massive success for Ukraine, there is plenty more work to do. Euromaidan press points out that Ukraine can't rush in. If HUR becomes too emboldened by its success, it may find itself running into Russian soldiers in other pockets who are better supplied than expected. The Russians have expanded their use of drones to supply encircled troops from the sky, dropping small containers of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Though insufficient for sustained combat, this has prolonged the survival of trapped units, Euromaidan press notes. Ukraine has to play the waiting game, and it strikes when Russia's troops are at their lowest. Ukraine has also been clever with the timing of its counterattacks, the same outlet reports. Rushing in creates the impression of a large and coordinated assault, Euromaidan press points out. Those types of assaults grab attention. They alert the Russian high command to what Ukraine is doing around Pokrovsk, which might prompt Russia to send even more soldiers to attempt to reinforce those stuck in the pocket. Instead, Ukraine allows the occupiers who make the breakthroughs to provide reports indicating that their positions are stable, only to rush them when the Russian high command is operating under false information. By the time any Russian commanders realize what's happening, Ukraine has retaken territory and has caused casualties that Russia never expected to experience. It's a very clever approach that forces Russian commanders to make snap decisions, leading to more losses. Ukraine is making Russia bleed for every inch it gains near Pokrovsk, all as Ukraine manages to retake some of the most important pieces of territory that Russia claimed during the summer offensive. And Russia's losses have been colossal near Pokrovsk. That's according to the Peaky Blinders unit of Ukraine's army, which is fighting tooth and nail against the Russian occupying forces in Pokrovsk. On November 2nd, that unit published a Telegram post in which it shared graphic aerial images of mangled and burned Russian soldiers littering the fields and streets where they had attempted to conduct assaults. Dozens of burnt or mutilated bodies of Russian soldiers lie in the open on the approaches to the city. Almost all of them were hit by drones, kamikaze drones, or Mavic airdrops, the unit declared in its post. For the sake of a few square kilometers, Russia puts thousands of its soldiers in charge, sending them to storm with just meat without any tactics or strategy. They are stupidly crushed with a large amount of meat. Russia is paying a heavy price for any gains it makes, the unit concludes. It's also paying the price while losing key villages to Ukrainian counterattacks, as we just saw thanks to HUR's late October operation. Let's talk numbers for a moment. When reporting on the Peaky Blinders unit's Telegram post on November 2nd, Euromaidan press reported that Ukraine's defense forces had managed to repel 36 of 38 Russian assaults on that day alone. The 2 successful assaults hadn't achieved much, whereas Ukraine's counterattacks allowed it to advance up to 0.4 kilometers, which is approximately 0.25 miles, in certain areas of the Pokrovsk front. So not only are Russia's assaults failing, but Ukraine is using the fact that Russia's assaults are so weak to advance. This is where snap decisions being made by Russia's local commanders in Pokrovsk come into play. As Euromaidan press puts it, local commanders, desperate to save their careers, sent several reinforcement attempts that only resulted in more massive losses. These localized decisions further weakened Russian cohesion and ensured Ukraine could dismantle the encircled formations methodically, one pocket at a time. That's the genius of Ukraine's strategy in Pokrovsk right now. With every village retaken, Ukraine forces Russia to recommit soldiers in directions where the country's commanders haven't accounted for. Why would they? The territory was captured, so they could send soldiers to other villages. At least that's what they would have thought until receiving word that Ukraine had liberated the territories Russia thought it had captured. Forced into trying to save face after losing territory they thought was safe, these commanders send weakened troops to reassault the reclaimed villages. Ukraine tears through these troops in no time, and the loss of those soldiers creates a domino effect elsewhere, as Russia's assaults on other villages are made weaker due to reduced manpower. That's how you get 36 out of 38 assaults failing. And it's also how you get massive Russian losses. We've already reported on the nearly 60 Russian soldiers surrendering and nearly the same amount being killed or injured in the retaking of Kucheriv Yar, Zatishok, and Shuketska. But this is just a small slice of the true scale of Russian losses around Pokrovsk. The casualty toll is massive. Ukraine's 1st Azov Corps, which was deployed in the Pokrovsk region toward the end of the summer after Russia had made substantial gains, reports that Russia lost 1,226 soldiers during 1 week alone in its area of responsibility. Those personnel losses were added to the 23 armored vehicles, 130 other vehicles, 226 drones, and 39 artillery systems. This is attrition. But not in the way that Putin expected. Those weekly numbers seem unrealistic. We only need to take a wider look at Russia's fortunes in the Pokrovsk region in 2025 to see how accurate they really are. Writing for his Trench Arc column on October 6th, military reporter David Axe noted that Russia had lost 100,000 soldiers to death or injury during the 2025 push for Pokrovsk alone. Axe also points to captured Russian documents that highlight the scale of Putin's meat grinder approach throughout Ukraine during this year. According to captured Russian documents, nearly 87,000 Russian troops died between January and September this year as Russia's wider war in Ukraine ground toward its 5th year. Another 160,000 were wounded, many badly, and 34,000 went missing, most of whom are probably dead, Axe reports. Add all of those numbers up, and you get around 30,000 Russian casualties per month. That amounts to around 1,000 per day, which is right in line with the 1st Azov Corps' claims. When we say that Russia is paying for every inch of territory that it takes in Ukraine with blood, this is what we mean. Pokrovsk was supposed to have been captured by the end of the summer. That was one of Putin's main goals for the summer offensive. Yet the city still stands. Plus, as we saw toward the end of October, Ukraine is retaking settlements that Russia intended to use as launch pads for a multi-directional assault on Pokrovsk, which means a job that was meant to be done by the end of summer is at risk of not being completed in 2025 at all. That will sting Putin. He knows, though it's debatable whether or not he cares, that the Russian military is bleeding far more heavily in Pokrovsk than he ever intended. However, some water has to be poured on the Ukrainian flame here. What HUR achieved in Kucheriv Yar and elsewhere with its airborne operation was remarkable, and it put a severe dent in Russia's plans to assault Pokrovsk. But reclaiming those villages doesn't mean that Russia is going to give up on Pokrovsk anytime soon. Putin keeps on pushing because he knows just how important Pokrovsk is to Ukraine, both logistically in the Donetsk region and symbolically as one of that region's most important fortress cities. Putin is angry that his forces haven't taken Pokrovsk yet. He has raged at his country's forces, demanding that they take Pokrovsk by the middle of November. That's according to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which noted that Russia is unlikely to achieve that goal, just as it has failed to take Pokrovsk the many other times that Putin has imposed an arbitrary deadline on the fall of the city. Putin regularly tasks the Russian general staff with seizing operationally significant swathes of land within unrealistic timeframes, and the timeframe within which Putin aims to seize Pokrovsk is not a realistic reflection of Russian forces' ability to seize the town, the ISW says. Still, the fact that the demand has been made at all tells Ukraine that it can't become complacent. Russia is still coming for Pokrovsk, and despite Ukraine's many successes, it's making progress at a snail's pace. Euromaidan Press points out that Russia still hasn't achieved the encirclement of Pokrovsk as of November 2nd. That's thanks in large part to the types of operations that HUR conducted in late October. However, intense fighting continues in the regions surrounding the city, and Russia is sticking with its strategy of sending small assault groups to create narrow gaps in Ukraine's defenses. The approach is starting to work, the BBC reported on October 28th. It says that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has confirmed that Russian forces have managed to establish a small foothold in Pokrovsk itself. That doesn't mean Pokrovsk is on the verge of falling. This foothold is likely similar to those we've seen elsewhere, meaning Russia's forces in the city have probably already been isolated. Still, the fact that Russian soldiers are in Pokrovsk at all highlights that Putin still has one major card that he is convinced will see Russia claim victory in Pokrovsk, a massive manpower advantage. Zelensky has confirmed that Russia is currently operating with an 8-to-1 manpower advantage in Pokrovsk, and that Ukraine can't hope to match Russia in sheer numbers. Around 200 Russian soldiers are inside Pokrovsk right now, Ukraine's president reveals, But Ukraine has eyes on those soldiers. Its drones have identified their positions. Russia likely can't do much more than this in Pokrovsk until it achieves its other objective of encircling the city. An assault from one direction can be controlled and contained by Ukraine, even when Russia has a manpower advantage. But assaults from multiple directions are much harder to contain, which is why special forces groups from HUR and the 1st Azov Corps are working so hard to retake the small settlements that Russia manages to occupy. The Guardian notes that Ukraine is well aware of how important its special forces are to the defense of Pokrovsk. On November 2nd, the outlet reported that Ukraine has deployed more of its special forces to the city. Those forces are operating in consolidated groups, the Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrsky, says. And for now, we are holding Pokrovsk, he adds. The question is, for how long? On October 31st, the Kyiv Independent reported that Zelensky believes there are now 170,000 Russian soldiers deployed in the Pokrovsk direction. That's 60,000 more than the 110,000 that Russia deployed during the start of the summer offensive that was supposed to take the city by the end of August. This higher number demonstrates both the manpower advantage Russia holds over Ukraine in Pokrovsk and the sheer amount of damage that Ukraine has managed to do to Putin's forces throughout 2025. Putin's solution to the Pokrovsk problem is to pour more meat into the grinder. Russia's strategy may yet work. An 8-to-1 manpower disadvantage will wear away on Ukraine's defenses, but until Pokrovsk falls, Ukraine will continue to make brutal pushes that are costing so many Russian lives in the city's surrounding regions. The best Putin can hope for now is a Pyrrhic victory in Pokrovsk, as Russia will have lost over 100,000 of its soldiers in less than a year to claim the city. Without fuel, Russia can't function, and Ukraine knows it. This is why Ukraine has been hitting Russia's oil refineries to take out the country's most important products at its source for months. But now Ukraine has gone a step further. It's not only making it much harder for Russia to make the fuel that its people and its army need, Ukraine is also taking out the pipelines upon which Russia relies to transport that fuel. The Russian war machine has been decapitated as Ukraine just cut one of the last lifelines Russia had for keeping its military supplied. Ukraine's target, as the Kyiv Post reported on November 1st, was a trio of fuel pipelines that are collectively part of the Ring refined oil pipeline that runs throughout Russia. That pipeline keeps gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel flowing through Russia, making it one of the most vital strategic arteries that the country has. The reasons why are simple. With the Ring, Russia is able to keep fuel moving from far-flung refineries and into Ukraine itself, ensuring its troops are stocked up with the fuel they need to launch their assaults. This pipeline is also vital for keeping fuel pumping throughout Russia itself. Without the Ring, the fuel shortages that are already racking Russia would only get worse. We say would, we mean will. That's because Ukraine's military intelligence has just conducted a precision strike against the Ring pipeline that has left Russia reeling. The pipeline, which is in the Remensky district of Moscow Oblast, has been devastated with drone strikes to the point where it hasn't just been damaged, it's been taken out of commission entirely. HUR, Ukraine's main intelligence agency, took to Telegram to explain what it managed to pull off overnight on October 31st. Rumble in the Moscow region. As a result of the HUR operation, 3 lines of an important military facility of the aggressor were destroyed, the Post began. On October 31st, 2025, as a result of the special operation by Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, HUR, a critically important military facility of the aggressor state of Russia was disabled. The Koltsevoy oil pipeline, which has been supplying the Russian occupation army with resources to conduct genocidal war against the Ukrainian people. Koltsevoy is the Russian word for ring or circle, and it highlights the circuitous nature of the pipeline that HUR just destroyed. The Post goes on to explain that Russia had already realized that this pipeline was a target for Ukraine, and it did everything that it could to defend it. Anti-drone nets had been erected at various points along the pipeline, HUR reveals, and Russia also had paramilitary guards on the ground, presumably to man air defense systems and prevent any ground forces from infiltrating in the direction of the pipeline. None of it mattered because Ukraine scored direct hits anyway. Another successful HUR operation in Russia is a serious blow to the military capabilities of the aggressor state, as well as to its economy, in particular in the Moscow region, HUR adds. HUR is right. The Ring pipeline was vital to Moscow. The Kyiv Post reports that the Ring is a 400-kilometer or 248-mile pipeline that connects several refineries around Moscow. Those include the refineries in Ryazan, Novgorod, and Nizhny, several of which Ukraine has already targeted with its long-range drone strikes, as well as a refinery in Moscow. Annually, this single pipeline transports around 1.6 million tons of gasoline, 2.8 million tons of diesel, and around 3 million tons of aviation fuel around Russia. That last type of fuel is extremely important. Russia needs aviation fuel inside Russia because one of its chief tactics is launching glide bombs against Ukraine from air bases that are on its own territory. The loss of the ability to transport up to 3 million tons of aviation fuel per year may mean that fewer of Russia's planes can take to the skies. And if there are fewer Russian planes in the skies, that also means fewer Russian glide bombs heading toward Ukraine. Russia sent emergency and security services to the site of Ukraine's strike almost immediately, United 24 media adds in its report on the pipeline attack. However, it didn't matter how quickly those services responded. The damage had been done, and the ring was rendered completely inoperable by Ukraine. Repairs will be underway, of course. However, much as we see with Ukraine's refinery strikes, Russia now has to try to repair a vital pipeline while dealing with limited resources and the threat of follow-up strikes to come. It's possible that Ukraine may have just taken out the ring for several months. Plus, HUR now knows that it can hit one of the most important Moscow fuel pipelines. If it could do it once, HUR may well be able to do it again. That will terrify Russia. But what will also worry Putin in particular is that Ukraine appears to be expanding the scope of its long-range strikes against Russia with this latest attack. For the past few months, Ukraine has been targeting Russia's oil refineries, hitting several of them many times over, to take around 38% of the country's refining capacity offline. That all made sense. With fewer refineries, Russia makes less fuel, which impacts its people, soldiers, and economy. Now, after spending so long hitting Russian fuel at its source, Ukraine has expanded its scope to the point where it's taking out the pipelines that transport the fuel that Russia still has. So even fuel that could be used by Russia's people or soldiers will either be forced to sit in storage or be transported by other means that result in it taking far longer to reach where it needs to go. Ukraine has achieved the same result that it did with the refinery strikes by taking out the ring. And it's all part of the plan to hobble the Russian war machine by devastating its logistical infrastructure. The loss of the ring already amounts to a terrible night for Moscow. However, as Ukraine has shown us many times in the past, when it rains, it really starts to pour for Russia. While the ring will naturally grab all the headlines from Ukraine's October 31st strikes, there were two more targets that have also been hit hard. Those targets include a thermal power plant in Oriel. The Kyiv Post reports that October 31st saw Ukraine unleash several drone strikes at key facilities across Russia, with the Oriel plant being one of them. Parts of that city were left without electricity, in an example of how Ukraine is bringing just a portion of the pain caused by Putin's invasion back to Russia's people without targeting them directly. Ukraine also struck energy infrastructure in several other Russian cities on the same night, taking out electrical substations and causing explosions that damaged everything from power supply equipment to oil refineries. These attacks come as temperatures in Russia are plunging to 41 degrees Fahrenheit and are set to get colder as winter beds in. Russia is getting set for a cold winter. If Ukraine has its way, Russian citizens are going to feel the freeze, and if they get cold enough, they may just direct their anger at Putin. The head of HUR, Lieutenant General Kirill Budanov, was quick to both laud Ukraine's latest operation and explain why it was so effective. Our direct actions have caused far greater damage to Russia than any sanctions applied so far, the Kyiv Post reports Budanov as saying. This is a mathematical truth. Our strikes hit the aggressor where it hurts most. Of course, this means that the big question has to be asked, is Budanov correct? On a purely monetary level, Budanov may be underestimating the impact that Western sanctions have had on Russia during the war. On June 13th, the UK government published a report on the findings of a Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office or FCDO study into the monetary impact that Western sanctions have had against Russia since Putin launched his invasion. The FCDO concluded that sanctions have cost Russia at least $450 billion that Putin might have been able to use to fund the war. That amounts to around $120 billion per year on average, which is a good benchmark to keep in mind. Of the $450 billion, $154 billion is in lost oil tax revenue. Price caps have come into play here. Russia's Urals crude benchmark pricing has fallen a long way behind the global Brent pricing due to both price caps and the discount Russia has to offer to countries that are still buying its fuel. However, there are a couple of catches to these figures. The first is that the $450 billion number includes the $285 billion of Russian assets that are currently frozen in the European Union, the UK, and elsewhere. The freezing of these assets indeed means that Putin can't use them, and that sanctions are responsible for this freezing. However, the frozen assets appear to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the $450 billion number, with the impact of sanctions on Russia's oil trade falling quite far behind. And that brings us to the second caveat to the FCDO's figures. Though Western sanctions have cost Russia a lot of money when it comes to oil and gas sales, some parts of the West have also been responsible for propping up Putin's war in ways they really shouldn't have. Back in April, the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air revealed that the European Union or EU has been buying about as much of Russia's fossil fuels in 2024 as it had been before the war began. Notably, the EU had spent around $25.4 billion on Russian fossil fuels in 2024. That was substantially more than the $21.69 billion in military aid that the EU sent to Ukraine during the same year, so there's a clear argument to be made here. As effective as Western sanctions appear to have been, based on the FCDO report, that effectiveness has also been undercut by the EU's seeming inability to extract itself from the Russian gas and oil teats. In 2024, the tax that Russia would have been able to generate from fossil fuel sales to the EU would have pumped billions into Putin's war machine that many would argue shouldn't have been available. The EU is doing something about this problem. The bloc is gradually phasing out its Russian oil and gas purchases to the point where it should be buying none of either from Russia by 2028. However, that's still a long way away, and it means that the EU will spend the next couple of years diminishing the impact of its own sanctions. Perhaps this is what Budanov means when he suggests that Ukraine's flying sanctions are more effective than the West's traditional ones. Ukraine's drones have certainly had an impressive financial impact on Russia. On August 15th, which is around the time that Ukraine started its renewed series of strikes on Russia's oil refineries, the Kyiv Independent reported that Ukraine had already enjoyed some significant results from its long-range strikes in 2025. Those strikes had cost Russia about 4% of its gross domestic product, or GDP, during the first 8 months of the year. That figure amounts to $74.1 billion, the Kyiv Independent notes. Assuming the same level of strikes, this means Ukraine would have cost Russia $111.15 billion by the end of 2025. That compares favorably to the $120 billion average cost caused by the West's sanctions we mentioned earlier. We could even go a step further and focus solely on the $154 billion in lost oil revenue that the FCDO claims that Western sanctions have caused. That amounts to about $41 billion annually, which is a long way behind what Kyiv claims its drones have cost Russia between January 2025 and the beginning of August, never mind how much Russia would have lost by the end of 2025. We keep saying would have here because Ukraine ramped up its refinery strikes in August, so the odds are that the $111.15 billion is now a fair way below what Ukraine has actually cost Russia in 2025. The real number, though not yet revealed by Ukraine, is likely much higher. Perhaps Budanov knows just how many billions more Russia has lost thanks to Ukraine's refinery strikes, which is why he claims that the maths add up when it comes to his claim. Right now, we don't know for sure. Ukraine will have to reveal more about what Russia has lost before we do. However, it's also important to note there is a big difference between traditional sanctions and Ukraine's flying sanctions. The former are primarily financial vehicles designed to deprive Putin of the money he needs to fund his invasion. As for the latter, they are very different. Ukraine's long-range drones demonstrably cause Russia a ton of financial issues that appear equal to, if not higher than, those caused by traditional sanctions. However, they also do something that not even the strongest of traditional sanctions can do. They bring the war back home to Russia. We touched on this earlier. Ukraine's drones are a symbol of a war that was never meant to reach Russian territory coming home to roost. With each of Ukraine's strikes, the Russian people see that Putin is lying to them when he says that Ukraine is on the verge of defeat. Those people hear and see the explosions. They feel the fear when a drone is overhead, even though that drone is heading to a refinery or military targets rather than their homes. Don't underestimate the impact that the visual and tangible effects of Ukraine's drones have on the Russian people. As AP News notes, some of Ukraine's drones have ranges of around 1,000 kilometers, roughly equal to 620 miles. That means these drones can strike deep into the heart of Russia's most populated border regions, as well as the capital city of Moscow. The same outlet reports on comments made by the director of the global risk analysis firm RAIN. Adriano Bossoni tells the outlet, "What we're seeing is that Ukraine is getting better at taking the war inside Russia. For most of the war, Russia operated on the assumption that its own territory was safe. That's no longer the case," Bossoni told AP News. That's the big difference. The effect of traditional sanctions make themselves known over time by gradually eroding Russia's financial capabilities. Ukraine's drones, its flying sanctions, are more visceral. They erode and explode. They also have a far more direct and immediate impact on Russia than traditional sanctions, and nowhere is that more evident than in the fuel crisis that Russia is experiencing right now. On October 27th, the Moscow Times reported that gasoline prices in Russia have risen by 11.6% since the beginning of 2025. This isn't natural inflation. It's a direct result of the supply and demand crisis that Ukraine has created with the refinery strikes that we mentioned earlier. Those strikes are intense. On November 1st, the Kyiv Independent reported on comments made by the head of the security service of Ukraine, Vasyl Malyuk. He said that Ukraine has scored at least 160 hits on Russian refining and oil extraction facilities in 2025 alone, with at least 20 of those strikes occurring in September and October. These are legitimate military targets. Oil extraction and refining make up around 90% of Russia's defense budget. These are the dirty petro-rubles funding the war against us, Malyuk points out. He also notes that Ukraine's strikes have hit so much of Russia's refining that the country is dealing with a 20% shortfall in the supply needed to feed its domestic demand for gasoline. None of this is coincidental. Ukraine knows precisely what it's doing with its long-range strikes against Russian oil. The attack on the Ring pipeline is just the latest in a series of strikes designed both to weaken Russia in Ukraine and, almost as importantly, cause pain to Russians who now find themselves lining up at the gas pumps to buy limited amounts of gasoline at inflated prices. Of course, Russia denies that it's Ukraine that's causing all of these problems. When discussing Russia's soaring gasoline prices, Russian Energy Minister Sergei Savilyov tried to claim that hurting its own citizens with high prices was all part of the Russian plan. Speaking to TASS, Savilyov claimed, "First, let me explain why this price situation arose in the first place. In August, prices on the exchange rose due to two main reasons. First, it was the season of scheduled maintenance at oil refineries, which reduced production volumes. Second, it was the traditionally high seasonal demand. Panic buying was also a problem," the energy minister added. And it was. But it was panic buying caused by Ukraine's flying sanctions, not because Russian citizens reacted poorly to supposed scheduled maintenance. The reality that Russia is trying to hide from its own people is that Ukraine's long-range strikes are succeeding so many times that they've pushed Russia into a fuel crisis. This wasn't anticipated. None of these attacks on Russian territory were. But these strikes are now a reality that Putin and his cronies have to deal with because they are a far more powerful reminder that Russia is at war than any traditional sanction ever could be. The Ring being shut down is just the latest reminder. Ukraine's drones hit hard and they can reach Moscow. If Putin is hoping that he can rely on the waning of Western support, resulting in fewer Ukrainian drone strikes, then he's sorely mistaken. The vast majority of Ukraine's long-range strikes are now being carried out using weapons made inside Ukraine itself. That's according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The Kyiv Post reports that Zelensky claims that between 90 and 95% of long-range strikes, like the one conducted against the Ring pipeline, are being made using Ukrainian weapons. The likes of Storm Shadow, ATACMS, and Scalp have been relegated to supporting roles, meaning it's no longer the West's long-range weapons that should be worrying Russia. It should be Ukraine's weapons. And things are only going to get worse for Russia as Ukraine's evolving capabilities mean that it's not just drones that are going to be flying into Russia as 2025 draws to a close. On October 28, the Kyiv Independent reported that Zelensky has confirmed that Ukraine is using two homegrown missiles inside Russia. Both the Flamingo and the Ruta have taken flight, with both boasting impressive ranges and far more powerful than the drones that Ukraine used to hit the Ring pipeline. On October 31st, Ukraine slashed the Ring. With the Flamingo, Ruta, and more taking flight, Ukraine is now ready to turn these slashes into full-blown decapitations. And if Russia can't find a way to stop Ukraine, it will run out of fuel and money long before Putin runs out of the soldiers that he's feeding into the Ukraine war meat grinder. For over a month, Russia has been attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Vladimir Putin's goal is to deprive Ukrainian civilians of the electricity and gas that they need to heat their homes as the cold winter months approach. It's a smart strategy, at least for a Russian leader who is more than happy to terrorize civilians as part of the war he's waging. But Ukraine isn't taking what Russia is doing lying down. Ukraine is fighting fire with fire by launching revenge strikes that are stripping Russian citizens of the power they need to get through the winter, and in doing so, Ukraine is exposing a weakness that Russia wants to pretend doesn't exist. What is that weakness? We'll explain it all later in the video, but for now you need to know what Russia is doing to Ukraine and how Ukraine has responded with a series of powerful revenge strikes. As CNN reported on October 10th, Russia has been falling back on a tactic that it has used in previous years of the Ukraine war. Since September, the country has redirected many of its long-range strikes away from Ukraine's cities and toward the energy infrastructure that enables people to heat and power their homes. The logic behind these strikes is simple. Ukraine has bitterly cold winters. People in Need says that temperatures in the country range from 23.36 to 35.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is between minus 4.8 and 2 degrees Celsius during the winter. Often these freezing cold periods of weather are accompanied by heavy snowfall and make it difficult to get around at the best of times, never mind when fuel and electricity are being cut. Russia is trying to inflict pain by taking out Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and it's a strategy that works. CNN says that Russia's strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure occur almost daily. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, adds that the strikes are very deliberate. Speaking in the wake of an October 10th attack that killed one person and left parts of Kyiv without power, Zelensky called the strike a cynical and calculated attack with more than 450 drones and over 30 missiles targeting everything that sustains normal life, everything that the Russians want to deprive us of. It's precisely the civilian and energy infrastructure that is the main target of Russia's strikes ahead of the heating season. Zelensky is far from the only person to take notice of Putin's strategy. The UK has also noticed, with its collective opinion being shared by Neil Holland. The head of the UK's delegation to the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe since May 2023, Holland condemned Russia's energy infrastructure attacks in a statement published by the UK government on October 16th. Russia has once again weaponized winter, launching a series of coordinated attacks on Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure in recent weeks. These strikes have severely disrupted gas production and hit critical storage facilities in western Ukraine, Holland said. He added that the United Nations has suggested that Putin's cynical targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure could amount to a war crime, especially given that this targeting has a severe impact on civilians and is always timed to coincide with the arrival of winter. Russia's daily energy infrastructure strikes are devastating, and if you have any doubt that they are a near-daily occurrence, news broke that Russia had conducted another one as we were creating this video. On November 2nd, Euronews reported that Russia had launched 79 drones and a pair of Iskander-M ballistic missiles at Ukraine. Those weapons targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure and residential buildings, killing 2 people and injuring 3 more. This is just one of many. And Ukraine had had enough long before it happened. Ukraine has seen this Russian tactic every year since Putin launched his invasion, and it's now giving Russia a taste of its own medicine. If Putin is so intent on depriving Ukraine's citizens of power, Ukraine will do the same to Russia. Ukraine's revenge was swift, merciless, and it succeeded in causing significant damage. Euromaidan Press provided the basic details in a November 2nd report. It says that Ukraine unleashed a flurry of drones against Russia and the Russian occupiers in Ukraine, all of which targeted high-voltage power infrastructure. 5 regions were targeted on the night of November 1st into 2nd, resulting in Ukraine managing to disable more than 5,000 megavolt amperes or MVAs or power. These November strikes also followed other attacks conducted on October 31st, which we'll discuss later in the video. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems, Robert Brovdy, took to Telegram to explain that Ukraine had targeted 8 Russian substations and had managed to hit 5 of them. During the past night, the SBS birds pecked at 5 substations all the way to Gryatsy, with a total capacity of 5,066 MVA. One of them was done by joint efforts with the SSO, Brovdy roared in his post. He also mocked Russia, adding, "Worms, remember, light heat, bada boom, dark winter. Blackout is not scary." Harsh words, perhaps, but they come from a man who has seen Russia do this very thing to his people time and time again. Now, Ukraine has the long-range capabilities, along with the sheer volume of drones, that it needs to send back a little of what Putin is giving to Ukraine. And on the night of November 1st into 2nd, Ukraine made sure that Russia was forced to swallow down a hefty dose of its own medicine. Brovdy mentions that 5 targets were struck. One of those targets was in Lipetsk. Ukraine targeted the Lipetskaya substation in Lipetsk with its drones. A 500 kilovolt substation, the site is a critical energy hub for central Russia's power network, Euromaidan Press reports. The substation provides electricity to Lipetsk's regional industries, including a major steel plant, and it serves as a connection point for several transmission lines. Meza adds that this particular substation was likely struck with cooperation from Ukraine's Special Operations Forces. Several videos of explosions in Lipetsk have been shared by the Euromaidan Press X account. It's difficult to make out anything in these videos as they all offer footage of pitch-black skies with no real landmarks, but every so often, a loud bang is heard or the flash of an exploding drone lights up the sky. Ukraine's drones were hitting their targets, and the residents of Lipetsk knew it. Next up was the Kursk Oblast. That oblast should be very familiar to anybody who's been keeping track of the Ukraine war. It is the oblast into which Ukraine launched a counter-invasion against Russia back in August 2024 that saw it snatch up several hundred square miles of Russian territory. Putin was left so embarrassed by the invasion of Kursk that he spent much of the summer trying to take territory in Sumy to create a buffer zone between Ukraine and the Russian border region. Clearly, he failed. Ukraine can still hit Kursk hard. In its revenge strike, Ukraine targeted the Zeleznogorsk substation. Euromaidan Press reports that at least 15 drones were seen in the city, with explosions and fires also being recorded. The first of the drones appeared at around 10 p.m. on November 1st, followed by waves of others that eventually took out a 330 kilovolt substation. That facility also happens to be located in the same city as the Mikhailovsky ore enrichment plant, which Euromaidan Press claims is a major component of Russia's military-industrial supply chain because it produces the components that are needed to craft armor-grade steel. Militarny offers more details, noting that the 15 drones that locals counted in Zhezhenorsk all arrived in a 50-minute window after 10 p.m. It also notes that the ore enrichment plant we just mentioned had previously been struck by Ukraine's drones, and it's operating under sanctions from the US. There's a clear logic here. If Ukraine and Western sanctions can't take out the plant, maybe cutting it off from its electricity supply, even if only temporarily, will do the job. Again, there is footage of Ukraine's drones doing their work. A local Russian outlet in Kursk has shared several videos of the Zhezhenorsk strike. In one of the videos, we see one of Ukraine's drones descending toward its target, though the footage doesn't show the aftermath. A separate video simply shows an explosion that lights up the night sky. It's unclear if this footage is linked to the first video, but it's obvious that Ukraine once again struck its target. Revenge is sweet for Ukraine. But the next strike on the list is a little stranger, as it involves Ukraine doing something that you might not expect. It attacked itself. Well, technically. Another of Ukraine's targets during its November 1st drone strikes was the region of Alchevsk, which is located in Luhansk. Though Luhansk is Ukrainian territory, much of the region has been occupied by Russia for most of the war. Reuters says that Russia held all of Luhansk as of August 2025, though they're still fighting in the oblast. That suggests that there are several grey zones that Russia doesn't fully control, though it's safe to say that Luhansk has very nearly fallen. So Ukraine targeting its own territory on November 1st makes perfect sense. It can always rebuild substations and other infrastructure after it retakes Luhansk. For now, destroying that infrastructure hurts the Russian military, which is Ukraine's main objective. Euromaidan Press reports that Ukraine struck a 220 kilovolt substation in Alchevsk. Again, there is footage of what Ukraine achieved. Ukraine Today shares several videos and a photograph, all of which show either explosions or a fire raging against the night sky. Euromaidan Press adds that this strike caused a blackout in the occupied region, meaning it did exactly what it was supposed to do. And on it goes. Euromaidan Press adds that Ukraine conducted strikes in the Oryol Oblast and Krasnodar Krai, in addition to causing a drone-related fire in Crimea. In the case of Oryol, it's believed that Ukraine managed to score a direct hit on the region's thermal power plant with Neptune missiles, with this strike appearing to take place a day before the attacks that targeted Russia's substations. And there was one last target on Ukraine's list, the Russian capital itself, Moscow. According to RBC Ukraine, panic reigned in the Moscow region on October 31st as power outages struck the city. The outlet says that several residents reported streetlights, along with the lights in their homes, beginning to go out during the evening. Videos were also shared on social media sites like Telegram showing the city engulfed in darkness. This, perhaps more than any other of Ukraine's energy infrastructure strikes, delivered a direct message to Putin. Blackouts outside of Moscow might be reported to Russia's leader, but he doesn't actually feel them. But when Moscow goes dark, it's impossible for Putin to ignore the reality of Russia's situation. Again, this blackout occurred the day before Ukraine's drone strike on other regions we've covered in this video. All the Moscow mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, could say, as his city was plunged into darkness, was that Russia's air defenses had managed to shoot down a Ukrainian drone. And perhaps they had. But with local authorities providing no reason for the Moscow blackout, it seems pretty clear that shooting down one drone wasn't enough. Another must have hit its target. Sobyanin's statement brings us back to the night of November 1st and Russia's response to what Ukraine achieved with its substation strikes over the weekend. By now, it should come as no surprise that Russia has done exactly what it always does: deny everything. Rather than admitting that Ukraine's drones scored direct hits, Russia is instead acting as though it shot down every drone that Ukraine sent in its direction. That's despite the many minutes of footage shared to social media that show Russia's various substations engulfed in flames. RBC Ukraine reports that Russia's defense ministry claims that the country's air defenses shot down 98 Ukrainian drones on the night of November 1st. Around 45 of those drones were reportedly shot down over Belgorod. That's likely the case. There are no reports of Ukraine scoring a direct hit in Belgorod, and Brovdi himself said that Ukraine managed to hit 5 of 8 targets. Belgorod's energy infrastructure seems to have escaped unscathed for now. Another 12 of Ukraine's drones were supposedly destroyed over Samara, along with 11 over Moscow, the Russian Defense Ministry claims. But when it comes to the regions we've covered, it seems that Russia was far less successful. It claims to have shot down 2 drones over Lipetsk and 1 over Kursk. Remember that residents have reported at least 15 drones in Kursk on November 1st. 1 drone out of 15 is a terrible result for Russia's air defenses in that vulnerable border oblast, and it brings us nicely back to something that we mentioned at the beginning of the video: Russia's biggest weakness. Ukraine has exposed the fact that Russia simply doesn't have anywhere near enough aerial defenses to contend with the hordes of drones that Ukraine is now capable of sending into Russian territory. Even if the Russian Ministry of Defense is telling the truth, and it did manage to destroy 98 of Ukraine's drones on November 1st, that doesn't change the fact that it wasn't enough. Plenty of Ukraine's drones still got through. The burning substations in several Russian regions are proof. The big problem that Russia has right now is that its air defenses are stretched far too thin to defend all of Russia and protect Russia's occupying forces in Ukraine. Part of the reason comes down to Ukraine itself. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost 1,235 of its anti-aircraft warfare units since the beginning of the invasion. That's a huge number, with the majority of that equipment likely having been lost inside Ukraine. This creates a big problem for Russia. Putin can't just allow his troops to go unguarded by air defenses as they attempt to launch assaults on Ukraine's defenses. Ukraine's drones, missiles, and aircraft would make mincemeat of the Russian forces. So every air defense unit that has been lost has to be replaced if Russia is to sustain the strength of its assaults in Ukraine. Those units don't just appear out of thin air. They're being pulled from inside Russia, which is what allows Ukraine to conduct strikes like those we saw on October 31st and November 1st. Russia simply doesn't have enough air defenses to guard against Ukraine's long-range drones anymore. Now Russia is getting desperate. Back in May, United 24 media reported that Russia had been caught attempting to install dozens of decoy S-300 and S-400 air defense units in its Far East region to mask the fact that it doesn't have the defenses it needs to protect that area. Those decoys are crude or incomplete, the outlet notes, which suggests that Russia has been forced to build them hastily. Many lack fake radar arrays that would make them more convincing, while others are built completely out of proportion, which makes them easy to spot. Russia's Far East is rarely a target for Ukraine. The distance makes it a challenging target for the country's missiles and drones. What has likely happened here is that Russia has been forced to withdraw legitimate air defense units from its Far East to send them into Ukraine or to guard against targets within Ukraine's range on its own territory. The decoys are supposed to hide the fact that Russia's air defenses are stretched thin. They're not doing a very good job. Another hint that Russia is struggling comes from Turkey. In September, Russia offered to buy back some S-400 air defense systems that it sold to Turkey several years ago. Turkey doesn't appear to have taken Russia's offer, at least not yet, but the fact that Russia is asking to buy these systems back at all is proof that it doesn't have enough of them anymore. Putin has been reduced to begging a NATO member for air defenses, and you can find out more about what that means for Russia, Turkey, and NATO in the video we published back in September. Frankly, Russia should have seen this coming. The sheer size of the country has often been highlighted as something Ukraine could take advantage of, even before Ukraine had the long-range drones and missiles that it's using to pelt Russia in 2025. Over 2 years ago, in May 2023, the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, highlighted that Moscow itself is almost defenseless against Ukrainian drones. At the time, this wasn't due to a lack of air defenses. Rather, the multi-layered defenses that surround Russia's capital are built to deal with incoming missiles rather than smaller and slower-moving drones that fly at much lower altitudes. Military theorists at the Russian Defense Ministry have openly noted the low efficiency and unreasonably high cost of defeating drones by traditional means. Defense is made more complicated because UAVs are often made of plastic and powered by a small metal engine, and so have a low radar signature. They fly at low speeds and low altitudes, making it hard to hit them from afar, CEPA said at the time. It looks like Russia hasn't been able to come up with a suitable solution in the 2.5 years since. By August 2024, Business Insider was already reporting that Russia's air defenses had been hobbled. The country had lost so much of its equipment that it was being forced into a position where it had to choose what to protect with the dwindling resources that it had left, the outlet claimed. It highlighted comments made by George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War, who said that Russia was rearranging its defenses to protect the areas that it perceived to be most under threat. This has resulted in Russia essentially creating a first line of defense in its border regions, meaning the locations behind those defenses were not adequately defended, according to Barros. That report came out over a year ago. Russia has lost more air defenses since, with Ukraine's November 1st success in Kursk proving that not even the previously heavily guarded border regions of Russia are as protected as they need to be. So Russia has a serious air defense problem, and if the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, is correct, that problem is only going to get a whole lot worse as the Ukraine war heads into 2026. On September 5th, RUSI member Dr. Jack Watling told The Sun that Russia is on course to run out of its current stockpiles of air defense missiles by February 2026. Though Watling cautioned that Russia may have the capability to rebuild its stockpiles of these missiles as it has in the past, Ukraine still has a window of opportunity to exploit. It will be able to exploit Russia's shortages and weaknesses to hit a growing number of targets and put pressure on Russian industry, Watling told The Sun.
Ukraine just revealed details of yet another successful deep strike mission on Russian soil. This time, Kyiv's covert operations specialists managed to take out one of Russia's most prized possessions, a brand new missile believed to be one of the best in the Kremlin's arsenal. It's another humiliation for the Russian President Vladimir Putin and another satisfying win for Ukraine. News of the incident was only just released by the head of the security service of Ukraine, Vasyl Malyuk, and shared at a press briefing by the country's President Volodymyr Zelensky on October 31. But the attack actually took place more than a year ago, on July 8, 2024 to be precise. On that date, in the dead of night, Ukraine Security Service (SBU), Main Directorate of Intelligence (GUR), and Foreign Intelligence Service (SERU) put their plans into action, taking out one of Russia's Oreshnik long-range ballistic missiles at the Kapustin Yar launch site in the Astrakhan region, which is situated in southeast Russia, bordering Kazakhstan and the Caspian Sea. Kapustin Yar is located at the northern edge of this region. It's been a major military training area for decades, dating back to the days of the Soviet Union. Numerous test launches of rockets and missiles have taken place here, and the area has nicknames like the Russian Roswell and the Soviet Area 51, due to the many top-secret weapons tests carried out here, along with alleged UFO sightings. This location also happens to be over 250 miles from the Ukrainian border, but as recent events have shown, Ukraine's armed forces have no trouble planning and executing attacks deep into Russia. Kyiv's forces have managed to bombard bases in Far East Russia, assassinate war criminals in mountainous central regions, and blow up high-value targets like oil refineries and production plants around its western territories. No part of Putin's vast domain is safe, and this recently revealed attack is yet further proof of that fact. Before now, only President Zelensky and a few foreign heads of state had any knowledge of this attack, but the GUR has now shared an extensive report on Telegram for all to see. Secret Operation. GUR, SBU and SZR destroyed a Russian Oreshnik missile complex on the territory of the Russian Federation. On the territory of the Kapustin Yar test site on the night of July 8-9, 2024, a ballistic missile of the Oreshnik complex of the aggressor state Russia was destroyed as a result of a joint operation of the GUR of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the Security Service of Ukraine, and the Foreign Intelligence Service. This was announced by the head of the SBU, Vasyl Malyuk, during a joint briefing with the participation of the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. According to him, the operation was classified and its results were reported only to the President of Ukraine and several leaders of foreign states. The President of Ukraine noted that, according to available information, the Russian Federation plans to deploy one of the Oreshnik complexes on the territory of Belarus. The radius of action of this system is about 5,500 kilometers and the dead zone is about 700 kilometers. We will remind you that last year the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine published the technical characteristics of the Oreshnik Kedar missile complex and a list of enterprises of the military-industrial complex of the aggressor state of Russia involved in its development. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine reminds that for every war crime committed against the Ukrainian people, there will be due and just retribution. As the Post notes, Russia reportedly has big plans for its Oreshnik ballistic missiles, which are very recent additions to the Kremlin's collection. They're believed to be based on the RS-26 Rubesh Intermediate Range Ballistic Missiles, or IRBM, which were developed in the 2010s and tested several times that same decade, but never officially entered service. Since Russia hasn't publicly revealed too many details about these missiles, military analysts and expert groups have been forced to speculate, using the data available to make educated guesses about what the missile might be made of and how it likely works. This is what they believe. Like the RS-26 Rubesh, on which it seems to be based, the Oreshnik is an IRBM that can be equipped with both conventional and nuclear warheads. it's capable of traveling incredibly quickly, with some reports suggesting peak speeds of up to or even over Mach 10, which is 10 times the speed of sound, or over 7,600 miles per hour. This, added to the fact that the missile is made to maneuver and evade enemy air defenses during its terminal phase, makes it extremely difficult to intercept in theory. On top of this, the Oreshnik is allegedly able to strike not just one, but up to 6 targets at a time. Here's how it appears to work. First, like any other missile, the Oreshnik is launched, presumably from specially designed platforms, using its first stage solid fuel to propel itself into the air and reach extremely rapid speeds in a matter of seconds. Eventually, the missile's first stage separates, with the empty fuel storage and burned out engines detaching from the remainder of the missile. Next, arguably the missile's most important component, its multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicle, MIRV, detaches from the upper stage and after a brief burst of acceleration flies on a ballistic trajectory in the direction of its objective. This is the most significant stage of the missile's journey because it's at this point that the MIRV is believed to be most vulnerable to interception and mid-air destruction. However, if it can evade detection and interception to reach its destination, the MIRV will then use its onboard guidance system to orient itself in the right direction before releasing the multiple warheads hidden inside it. These warheads, each reportedly containing up to 6 submunitions, then fall to Earth one by one, each hitting a different patch of land and, in theory, a different and specific target. Experts know all this because the Oreshnik was reportedly used on November 21, 2024 in an attack on the Pivdenmash defense facility in Dnipro, Ukraine's 4th largest city. Initial reports suggested that this attack involved some sort of intercontinental ballistic missile, but subsequent assessments of the evidence identified the Oreshnik IRBM as Russia's weapon of choice. Putin himself also confirmed that Russia had successfully tested its new missile, stating, "We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against the military facilities that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities." Putin went on to state that the Oreshnik attack on Ukraine was a message to the Russian armed forces, the citizens of our country, our friends around the world, as well as those who continue to harbor illusions about the possibility of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. Now, it's believed that the missile used that night also came from the Kucheriv Yar training ground, and footage of the moment of impact shows the 6 individual warheads striking the ground in different locations. Fortunately, later reports revealed that despite the dramatic images captured at the scene, no major damage was sustained, with Russia using dummy warheads instead of real explosives, as confirmed by senior editor of the German tabloid Bild, Julian Ropke. Multiple surveillance cameras captured what are known as submunitions, i.e. an RS-26 re-entering the lower atmosphere. This horrific footage shows 6 missiles falling from the sky through the clouds. The peculiarity is that it was a decoy with the same mass and size, which is supposed to simulate a nuclear charge. This confirms it was a propaganda and political move, not a military one. There was no nuclear charge or explosives inside, which is why the damage was minimal. We don't see explosions in the video of the attack, only kinetic energy from a fall from a height of several hundred kilometers. Now, satellite images of the scene later confirmed that only minimal damage had been sustained to some of the roofs of the Pivdenmash buildings. Putin, meanwhile, has boasted of the Oreshnik's alleged power, stating at a Collective Security Treaty Organization (CSTO) summit in Astana, Kazakhstan. "We will respond with possible continued combat testing of the Oreshnik as we did on November 21st. The Ministry of Defense is currently selecting targets. These could include military installations, defense industry enterprises, or decision-making centers in Kyiv. Serial production of the Oreshnik has already begun. This missile can destroy even highly protected targets located at great depths. It reduces everything to dust. If the Oreshnik were used en masse, the force of the strike would be comparable to that of a nuclear weapon. No supply of even the most modern weapons to Ukraine will change the situation on the battlefield." Russia's president has also spoken about how his nation's new missile allegedly contains dozens of homing warheads that can strike targets with expert precision, how it can travel at speeds 10 times faster than sound, and how it generates temperatures on the ground at the point of impact that are comparable to those on the surface of the sun. He claimed too that the Oreshnik was more than capable of destroying underground bunkers situated 3 or 4 floors below ground, suggesting that the Kremlin could use it as some sort of bunker buster, summer, taking out underground shelters or storage facilities in Kyiv and other locations around Ukraine. Of course, as it's known from countless examples in the past, Putin is prone to exaggeration, as well as blatant misinformation. He habitually stretches the truth and regularly makes up claims entirely to paint his country and his army in a far stronger light than it actually is. As such, we cannot take his claims about the Oreshnik as gospel, and it may in fact be nowhere near as powerful as he claims. Indeed, several experts have issued criticisms of the Oreshnik based on available data about it. Fabian Hoffman, for example, who is a defense expert and doctoral research fellow at the University of Oslo, claimed that despite a new name, the Oreshnik was actually little more than a continuation of the RS-26 project. I'd be extremely shocked if this missile system had more than 10% new parts. I think basically they just took apart the R-26 or just cannibalized it and then put together this new missile with a couple of upgrades and a new paint job. He went on to call for a calm reaction to the missile's reveal, while calling out Putin for his exaggerated claims about its velocity. I think it's really important that we don't overreact. I like his Putin's hypersonic comment. Of course, he had to put that in, but every medium-range ballistic missile will reach hypersonic velocity at one point, so this is just nothing. Jeffrey Lewis of Middlebury Institute of International Studies in California agrees. After examining images of the wreckage of the missile that was used in Dnipro, he argued in an interview with Reuters that Russia was simply reusing old technology rather than introducing anything new or particularly groundbreaking. This is a new capability, but it's not a new capability that represents a dramatic change in the way that conventional weapons are developed. It's a series of old technologies that have been put together in a new way. Lewis went on to call the Oreshnik an expensive method to deliver not that much destruction, before suggesting that Putin was intentionally exaggerating the missile's capabilities as a way to intimidate Ukraine and the Western world. If it were inherently terrifying, Putin would just use it, but that's not quite enough. He had to use it and then do a press conference, and then do another press conference and say, "Hey, this thing is really scary. You should be scared." Michael Bonert, a defense analyst at RAND, spoke to Business Insider and also criticized the Oreshnik's cost-effectiveness and actual battlefield value. Oreshnik missiles are incredibly expensive for their limited conventional warhead size and quantity. While it has the range to target many locations without matching air defenses, its literal kinetic impact would still be low for the cost. At the same time, while criticisms can be clearly leveled at the Oreshnik and many other elements of the Kremlin's arsenal, it would be unwise to write this missile off as some sort of inoffensive failure. The best missiles have to fulfill 3 core criteria. They have to be fast, able to travel long distances, and capable of dealing enormous damage to their target. On paper, the Oreshnik checks all 3 boxes. It's believed to be lightning fast, as mentioned earlier, with peak speeds of Mach 10. It covers huge distances in a matter of minutes, and is reported to be capable of carrying out mid-air maneuvers in the final stage, which may aid in evading air defenses, improving the missile's odds of success. As far as range goes, Zelensky himself has stated that the Oreshnik has a reported range of up to 3,500 miles with a 453-mile dead zone, or no escape zone, which is where the probability of the missile successfully striking its target is at its greatest point. Thanks to that, Moscow would likely have little trouble striking not just any target in Ukraine, but even locations much further away, like the Baltic states, Poland, and other countries that have been rumored to be next on the Kremlin's hit list. Russia has even claimed it could attack any location in Europe with Oreshniks in under an hour. What's more, Zelensky has warned that Russia intends to relocate some of these missiles to Belarus, which would bring even more European targets into range. We understand that their approximate range is 5,500 kilometers and there is a dead zone of 700 kilometers. This means that Europeans, especially those in Eastern Europe, should pay attention to this. And everyone else too, we must pay attention to these risks. As far as firepower goes, Putin's claims of the Oreshnik turning anything it impacts to dust may be somewhat exaggerated, but there's certainly potential for this missile to deal a worrying amount of damage. It reportedly fires up to 6 warheads, each with up to 6 submunitions. That's up to 36 explosives in total, all hitting different locations on the ground and creating fireballs on impact. This means that the Oreshnik doesn't even necessarily need to be fired with immense accuracy because it can hit such broad areas, as confirmed by Tim Wright of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, confirmed to Reuters. It would distribute them submunitions over a wide area. It makes it useful for attacking large facilities. A well-placed Oreshnik strike could in theory deal devastating damage to expansive pieces of infrastructure, large structures, or concentrations of troops spread out around the battlefield. Fortunately, Russia doesn't seem to have too many of these missiles at its disposal at the moment. Back in June, while giving a televised speech to a graduating class of military cadets, Putin confirmed that large-scale production had begun. Serial production of the latest Oreshnik medium-range missile system is underway. He didn't, however, state exactly how many missiles were being made. According to Ukraine, the answer is not a lot. President Zelensky states that Russia only has the capacity to make up to 6 each year. 3 were allegedly made in 2024, with one being launched at Dnipro and the other being taken out in Kucheriv Yar by Ukraine's covert ops team. So even if Russia ramps up production, it's only going to have a handful of those missiles to play with, and that won't be enough to make any lasting change in the war. Additionally, with the Russian economy in such a perilous position at the moment, the Kremlin may not even have the funds needed to produce more Oreshnik missiles, or may prefer to allocate its resources elsewhere, focusing more on existing systems that have actually proven to be somewhat effective in Ukraine. Either way, the fact that Ukraine managed to take out one of these missiles, which inevitably cost a huge amount of money to make, is a cause for celebration, and there are 3 big takeaways from this story. First, as stated earlier on, this attack took place last year in the Russian region of Astrakhan, several hundred miles away from Ukraine. This proves that Ukraine can conduct successful strikes deep behind enemy lines. Thanks to that, Russian commanders know that no matter where they position, store, or hide their most expensive and important assets, they'll never be 100% safe from Ukraine's drones, missiles, and covert operators. Kyiv's forces can strike anytime, anywhere, and there's very little that Moscow can do about it. Second, it's interesting to note that this attack is only being learned of more than a year after it occurred. Often, Ukraine claims responsibility for attacks on Russian targets right away, or the GUR shares in-depth reports on Telegram and elsewhere, celebrating its latest victory and listing the various Russian assets its forces damaged or destroyed. This time was different. Ukraine decided to keep all information about this attack under wraps, playing its cards close to its chest. And this raises the question, how many other attacks have there been that aren't yet known about? It's highly likely that Kyiv's forces have taken out numerous other Russian weapons and assets over recent weeks and months, but are not yet ready to share their reports with the wider world. Therefore, it's possible that there may be additional attacks, just like this one, revealed in the months to come. The third and final takeaway is this. In its Telegram post, the GUR noted that back in late 2024, it published a report detailing the technical specifications of the Oreshnik missile, as well as a list of Russian military companies that are responsible for developing and producing it. In other words, Ukraine's forces know which companies are contributing to this missile, and they know exactly where those companies are based. Kyiv's drones and missiles could ultimately rain down fire on these all-important elements of Russia's military defense complex before the year is out. Now, watch this video to learn about yet another Russian army innovation that was heavily hyped by Putin but has since turned out to be a complete failure. Or check out this video to see how Ukraine is waging an astonishing second war deep inside Russia, using covert ops, infiltration missions, and a shadow network of partisans and intelligence operatives to dismantle the Kremlin from within. And finally, remember to subscribe to our channel too, to continue to be informed, up to date, and aware of everything that's really happening in the Russia-Ukraine war and other major conflicts worldwide.